Hallelujah. Any questions on anything so far that we've covered? We need to go back over. You're all up to date on everything now. Well, we'll be looking, we're going to go back quickly over 25 here because we had to hurry to get through with it last time, but we'll be looking at the history of Isaac and Jacob from 26 on through chapter 36 here of Genesis. Going back to chapter 25, it appears that chapter 25, and some of these things now that we're covering might not mean a lot to you because you've never thought, one way or the other. But they'll mean things to people who have really studied their Old Testament. And to you people, especially later on when you go back, and you won't have problems with the things that a lot of people have problems with to begin with, because before you even knew there was a problem, we went ahead and answered the problem for you. But for people that have studied here in the Old Testament, we could just take the book of Genesis. We could spend, a long time just on this one book because it's so compact with so much material. Then these first few verses here of chapter 25 pose a problem to us. But as I began saying, it appears that what we have here is not in chronological order. It's just that the anointed historian did not want to break the narrative, the sequence of the narrative dealing with the son Isaac, so he's waited until chapter 25 here and stuck in this short account about Abraham. Now Sarah's dead, of course. Abraham here in verse 1, then again Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah. And we see here in verse 2, she produces 6 more sons, in addition to the 2, Ishmael and Isaac, that Abraham already had. Now, remember Sarah, let's see, that was the first verse of chapter 23, died at the age of 127 years. This means with Sarah, of course, being 90, around the time Isaac was born, she lived 30 years, or 37 years, after the birth of Isaac. From 90 to 127, she lived 37 additional years. Now, Abraham was 100 years old at the birth of Isaac. That would put him, if this is in chronological order, at least, since we know that Sarah has already died, if he was 100, this puts him at least now 137. Really would probably put him a little further past this, which raises an interesting problem here. Remember that Abraham, we're told by Paul's commentary in Romans chapter 4, had a miracle worked in his life because the powers of procreation, of course, had departed from him by the time he was 100, and this is why we have the miracle birth of the child Isaac. Not only himself, but of course also Sarah, as we see she's 90 years old herself. This means that if chapter 25 is in chronological order, Abraham is still producing more sons, more children here at 137 years of age, which is something we don't need to assume at all. And we don't need to assume at all that Keturah was a second wife that Abraham married after the death of Sarah. Now, if you've read Genesis at all, most of you probably assume that as soon as Sarah died, or sometime after Sarah died, he married Keturah. And that's simply not true at all. This should have been placed back earlier as far as chronology goes. And I'll show you why. First of all, if we go back to chapter 16, chapter 16. Remember, they've had a problem, or especially Sarai at this time has had a problem because she's not been able to produce children. So what does she do? Well, she gets her handmaid, an Egyptian that she had gotten from Pharaoh back in chapter 12. The name of her handmaid is Hagar. She gives Hagar to Abraham. And if you look in verse 3, and Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, After Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, this makes him 85, and gave her, Hagar, to her husband Abram to be his wife. Now, it's using wife in a secondary sense. It's a different word than is used whenever it talks about Sarai being Abram's wife. Two different words, because this second word used is only used in a secondary sense. She's not a real wife at all. She's no more than a concubine. Now, when we come over here to chapter 25, we have the same word used for Keturah that's used for Hagar, which is a different word than the word used for Sarai being Abram's wife. Are you following that? So this shows us it's not a new marriage, a new wife at all. It's just another concubine that he's had. Now, this needs to be put in here because one of the important sons that is produced we see towards, well, the middle of verse 2 is Midian. And, of course, we get the Midianites, who become a great problem during the period of the Judges to the nation of Israel. But going down in verses 5 and 6, and Abram gave all that he had unto Isaac, but unto the sons of the concubines. There it uses that word. And this was, of course, Keturah, one of them, which Abraham had. Abraham gave gifts and sent them away from Isaac his son, while he yet lived, eastward unto the east country. And these are the days of the years of Abraham's life, which he lived, 160 years. Then Abraham gave up the ghost and died in a good old age, an old man, and full of years, and was gathered to his people. And his sons Isaac and Ishmael. Now Ishmael has come back now for the funeral or the burial here of his father Abraham. Buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron the son of Zohar the Hittite, which is before Mamre. And one other text that's conclusive is over in that genealogy, the first chapter of 1 Chronicles. And verse 32 shows you that this is not a second marriage that Abram's had to Keturah after the death of Sarah. 1 Chronicles 1:32. You'd be surprised how important these genealogies are in these first 9 or 10 chapters of 1 Chronicles. A lot of information we find here in these genealogies that we don't find elsewhere in the Old Testament. Or otherwise, it's not stated as explicitly. Verse 32, now the sons of Keturah, Abraham's concubine. You see, not his wife there. Wife in a secondary sense, which was, in all essence, a concubine, which they were allowed to have. Some of them had many concubines. Now, as I said last time, also just another tidbit, I suppose, from Genesis 25. If Abraham dies whenever he's 175, and he had Isaac whenever he was 100 years old, this makes Isaac 75 years old whenever Abraham dies. But we see from verse 26 of chapter 25 that 15 years prior to this, Isaac and his wife Rebekah give birth to their two sons, Jacob and Esau, which would make Isaac 80 years old there. He's 60 years old. And this would mean that Abraham was living for 15 years, the first 15 years of the life of Jacob and Esau. Now, that's something that's crucial to understand. And this is why over in Hebrews chapter 12, Paul is writing in such an adamant manner against Esau, that he's without excuse in what he did, because he had the great patriarch, his grandfather, Abraham himself, still alive for 15 years of his life, to tell him of all the promises that God had made to him that he was going to do through his sons and his sons' sons, but only the ones who had the birthright and who had the blessing. And we see that Esau, because he was, as the New Testament calls him, a profane person, gave up first of all his birthright and secondarily, as we'll see over in chapter 27, his blessing. Now, one other thing we'll have to go back and review. Well, let's just read this account first of all, Genesis 25:24. Now, they've been married 20 years. Isaac and Rebekah have been married 20 years, and she's been barren now for 20 years. And when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red all over like an hairy garment, and they called his name Esau. And after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold on Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years old when she bare them. The boys grew, and Esau was a cunning hunter and a man of the field. And Jacob was a plain man, dwelling in tents. That is, he lived in the plains, not a plain, ordinary man. And Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And Jacob sawed pottage, and Esau came from the field, and he was faint. And Esau said to Jacob, Feed me, I pray thee, with that same red pottage, for I am faint. Therefore was his name called Edom, that we'll see developed over in chapter 36, that from Esau came the Edomites, that the Israelites had a lot of trouble with, as we see over in the book of Obadiah. And Jacob said, Sell me this day thy birthright. And Esau said, Behold, I am at the point to die, and what profit shall this birthright do to me? And Jacob said, Swear to me this day. And he sware unto him, and he sold his birthright unto Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he did eat and drink, and rose up and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Now let's go back to chapter 11, the end of chapter 11, which again is another place filled with some historical genealogical material. We went over, I believe that was chapter, 24? We didn't read it, but we mentioned it. 24, yes, is where we have Isaac finding his wife, Rebekah. Well, who is this Rebekah? Well, we have to go back to confusing details, at least to some people, in the end of Genesis 11. Now, these are the Toledot of Terah, and Terah begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran begat Lot. And that's not all that Haran begat, but that's just one name mentioned there in verse 27, but we have another name mentioned in 29. You see, this is real confusing to put all these names and lists together. And Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity in Ur of the Chaldees. And Abram and Nahor, so these are the two surviving brothers, took them wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai. The name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, which is not only his wife, but also his niece, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. And Sarai was barren, she had no child. Remember earlier, in an earlier message, I guess that was last time, we showed you how that Sarai was not only the daughter-in-law to Terah, but she was also the daughter of Terah, as we're told over in chapter 20. You remember that. Now see, we don't find that out from this chapter. We find that over in chapter 20. Now, we have an interesting thing here that we find out all in this chapter with regard to Milcah. The name of Nahor's wife, but also his niece, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, because Haran was Nahor's brother, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. Now, we have to take something else along with that, the genealogy over in the end of chapter 22. Because you see, you'll see how closely related Isaac and Rebekah really are. And this was allowed now. You have to remember, this was allowed by God in these times for them to marry fairly close relatives. Back in the patriarchal time, of course, it was much closer than allowed during the Levitical laws, as we'll see later on over in Leviticus 18. But God there again, in many of those laws in Leviticus, not only was he trying to teach them a spiritual purpose in keeping themselves from the world and from unclean things, but there are many health and dietary purposes underlying some of the principles and statutes that God gives to the people. And of course, we know this from medical science today. It's dangerous, physically speaking, to marry someone that's too close to you. It's just dangerous to do that. But evidently they were blessed back then, and no one was suffering any harm. Verse 20, And it came to pass after these things that it was told Abraham, saying, Behold, Milcah, which would be what to Abraham? I'm going to see if you're following along. Well, what else? Sister-in-law. sister-in-law also, because she's not only the daughter of one of Abraham's brothers, Haran, she's also the wife of another of his brothers. Okay? You got that, brother? Behold, Milcah, she hath also borne children unto thy brother Nahor. Huz and Buz, Huz his firstborn and Buz his brother. And Chemel the father of Aram, and Kesed, and Hazo, and Pildash, and Jidlaph, and Bethuel. Now Bethuel is a male's name here. You can't really tell who's a male or who's a female, but Bethuel is a male. And Bethuel begat Rebekah. Now you see, it just slips that name Rebekah in there. But this is why we've got this genealogy, to find out where in the world does Rebekah originate. We know that she's the brother of Laban, which would make Laban also a descendant or a son of Bethuel. Bethuel begat Rebekah. These 8 Milcah did bear to Nahor, Abraham's brother. Now finally back to our chapter 25, and verse 19. So you see, this makes Milcah, first of all, she's the niece and she's the sister-in-law to Abraham. She is the mother of Bethuel, and Bethuel is the father of Rebekah. And these are the Toledot of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begat Isaac. So here we have one of the brothers. Abraham begets Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to wife, the daughter of Bethuel, who was the son of Milcah and Nahor, the Syrian of Padan Aram, the sister to Laban the Syrian. So you see, we've got a real close family relationship here. And this is important because Abraham has to make sure that his descendants don't get mixed up with the Canaanites and all the other tribes there, the heathen pagan tribes that are there in Palestine. And this is why we have chapter 4, and Abraham's servant, who possibly was Eliezer if he was still alive, going back to, first of all, find a wife for Isaac, and then we'll see Jacob has to take a trip back to the same direction. Okay, let's see. Well, that would bring us on to chapter 26, is where we want to start this evening now. Now, it's interesting of the patriarch Isaac, we have less space given to him than all the other patriarchs. As a matter of fact, really all we have is the end of chapter 25 and chapter 26. And that's a very short amount of material compared to all the material that's given to Abraham, that's given to Jacob, and that's given on down through Joseph also. But apparently the reason why we're only given a small amount of material that has to do immediately with the patriarch Isaac is because he occupies so much space back in the earlier portions of Genesis as being a child yet unborn. Because God, every time he appears to Abram, it always has something to do with Isaac. So plenty of space has already been given to Isaac, even though he's not even born back in the earlier portions of Genesis. This apparently is why he's given only a chapter and a half here of material concerning him, because God's given plenty of material about his miracle birth, and that was the important thing about Isaac. It was a miracle, his birth, that God went ahead and got this in Scripture earlier. Okay, in chapter 26, we have Isaac going down to Gerar, duplicating what his father Abraham had done earlier, and that is passing off his wife as his sister. There was a famine in the land beside the first famine, that was in the days of Abraham. Now, when was this famine? What chapter was that in? Don't look for a cross-reference now. The famine that was in the days of Abraham was back in chapter 12, and that's why he ended up having to go down to Egypt, and he confronted Pharaoh because there was a famine in the land. So we've got our second major famine in Palestine now. It's during the days of Isaac. And Isaac went unto Abimelech, king of the Philistines, unto Gerar. Now that should ring a bell with you. Turn back to chapter 20. Now chapter 20 is when Abram is around 100 years old, because we don't have the birth of Isaac until 21. So Abraham's around 100 years old in chapter 20. And Abraham journeyed from thence toward the south country and dwelled between Kadesh and Shur and sojourned in Gerar. Now here we've got the same name again, Gerar. I don't know if I have a map that shows Gerar on it. I can show you around where it is, though. You'll understand where they're talking about. Now the Philistines, this is the first time that we're coming across the Philistines. Here, these were Philistines back in chapter 20. They're called that specifically in chapter 26, where we're found right now. The Philistines were coastal people who occupied what is known as the maritime plains in Israel, and this is the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea, or the western boundary of the country of Palestine, which amounts to this region here. Basically, it extends from the city then and still today, Gaza. You see Gaza here, all the way up to Tyre and Sidon. This was a coastal region. At this time, they're not a very powerful people. They still have basically small tribal chieftains. Remember, it's not until the days of King David that these become a powerful people. And David is the one that's warring against the Philistines. But here we have them mentioned. Now, Gerar it's not a coastal city, so it's located somewhere right over here. So this would be at the very southern extremity of the region of the Philistines of that day. This is around where Gerar is located. Oh yeah, that shows up clear. Here's Beersheba. We come across Beersheba just scores and scores of time in the Bible. And generally they refer to Beersheba as being the very southern boundary of occupied Israel. They own territory further south, but Beersheba is the end of occupied southern Israel. So remember where Beersheba is, so we'll be coming back to that. Okay, where was I? Verse 1 of 20, he's gone down to Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. Now, seeing if you're following along here, what type of problem are we presented with between chapter 20 and chapter 26? Pardon? Okay, some say it's the same story. We're assuming that it's a different story, which it is, because we've got different people involved. Some of the people are different, or are they? But what's the major problem now besides that with chapter 20 and chapter 26? It's a time problem. How old? Okay, how old is Abraham here in chapter 20? He's 100. How old is Isaac in chapter 26? 70, 75, we don't know exactly. He's got to be older than 60 when he had his boys. They're already grown up to the point where they're out hunting. 75, 80 years. So we've got a lapse between chapter 20 and chapter 26 of 70, 80, 90 years. Now we've got a problem. It mentions the same fella, king over the same people in the same place. Now, we're going to assume that these ungodly people like this lived to the same age as people of Abraham did? Well, let's go back over to chapter 21 and verse 22. This makes it even more difficult. And it came to pass at that time that Abimelech and Phicol, now Abimelech is king and Phicol is his chief captain. The chief captain of his host spake unto Abraham, saying, so forth. Abimelech and Phicol. Back over to 26. And verse 26. Then Abimelech went to him from Gerar, and Ahazath, one of his friends, and Phicol, the chief captain of his army. So here we got two fellas. They've got to be 130 or 40 years old by this time. Well, really we've got no problem at all. If we take in mind, let's go back to chapter 12 and see if you can tell me how we're to reconcile these differences here. There is the possibility that they could have lived that long, but that's very disputable. That you'd have the exact same king and the exact same chief captain after almost 100 years. That's totally illogical. And it's also totally illogical that we're going to have the king name the same thing and the chief captain name the same thing all over again. But when we go back to chapter 12, we have some help. Verses 14 and 15. And it came to pass that when Abram was come into Egypt, the Egyptians beheld the woman that she was very fair. The princes also of Pharaoh saw her and commended her before Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Now, how do you think this could relate to what we're talking about from chapter 20 and from chapter 26? It's a title. Now, you see, you wouldn't have known that about Pharaoh unless you learned it in Sunday school or something. I mean, if you were reading the Bible for the first time, you would think this was Mr. Pharaoh. His name was Pharaoh. But you know enough about Egypt to know Pharaoh was never the name. It was a title that was given. And we have just scores and scores of different pharaohs that had different names that lived during different times. Well, this is what we have. We know from archaeology. The same with chapter 26. And it would appear like Abimelech is a name, and Phicol are names. They're not names at all. They're titles. That was a title given to the Philistine king, and that was a title given to the Philistine chief captain, at least those that dwelt in the southern city of Gerar. So we've got no problem. These, most likely, I mean, we've got 1% chance that they could be the same individual, but for the most part, we can assume that they're not the same individual because we do know that these were two names popularly and frequently used for titles of the leaders of Philistia and the Philistines. Okay, we're back to 26. Isaac went down to Abimelech, which is a title. Now, what his name is, we don't know. We just know that that's comparable to Pharaoh. King of the Philistines unto Gerar. The Lord appeared unto him and said, Go not down into Egypt. Dwell in the land which I shall tell thee of. Now, you see, God had allowed Abraham in chapter 12 to go down to Egypt during this time of famine. But here he's putting a stop. And he says, No, Isaac, you don't go down. You dwell in this land. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with thee, and will bless thee. For unto thee and unto thy seed I will give all these countries, and I will perform the oath which I swear unto Abraham thy father. And I will make thy seed to multiply as the stars of heaven, and will give unto thy seed all these countries. And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Because that Abraham, and here's a good verse for obedience, obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Now, the interesting thing here we have in verse 4 is that God tells Isaac that in his seed, not in himself, but in his seed, would all the nations of the earth be blessed. Do you remember from chapter 12 and verse 3, the language which God employed to say a similar thing to Abraham? Genesis 12:3, the end of the verse, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Now, these may appear to you technical matters, but they're not technical at all, because this is the progression of the covenantal revelation that God has given to these patriarchs. It's a progressive revelation that he's giving to them. He starts off with Abram just in a general sense, in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Remember, it's not until his great trial of obedience, which would be chapter 22, offering up his son Isaac, that God appears to him the second time in this chapter and concludes with verse 18, Genesis 22 and 18. And in thy seed. Now he's changed it from saying in you. He's getting more specific here. But in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. And that's what we just read in 26 and verse 5. Because that Abraham obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. We'll see again mentioned to Jacob later on the same thing. Rather than in thee, it's no longer in thee, in other words. God starts off in a general sense saying to Abram, in thee, but he changes it in chapter 22 to say, in thy seed. He continues this with Isaac here in this chapter 26 and verse 4, in thy seed, and he will continue the same thing with Jacob. And Isaac dwelt in Gerar, and the men of the place asked him of his wife. And he said, She is my sister. For he feared to say, she is my wife. Now, really, she would be more like a cousin once removed, if anything. Not exactly that, but more like a cousin once removed. But these terms, wife, sister, brother, are used in a broad sense, as we see in the case of, I believe, Daniel chapter 5, where Belshazzar is called the son of Nebuchadnezzar. But we know that there was another king that came in between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, which would make Belshazzar the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. A puzzling problem to scholars from Daniel 5. But I believe your margin over in Daniel 5 does give you the correct meaning of the word, that he's not his literal son, but he's his grandson. For he feared to say, she is my wife, lest, said he, the men of the place should kill me for Rebekah, because she was fair to look upon. Now, she's an old woman by this time, too, but she's retained her comeliness. And it came to pass, when he had been there a long time, that Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out a window and saw, and behold, Isaac was sporting with Rebekah his wife. Well, you may be too young to know what that means, but you can tell probably from the language of the verse what they were doing. They were sporting with one another. And Abimelech, and he knew, you don't sport with your own sister. And Abimelech called Isaac and said, behold, of a surety she is thy wife. And how saidest thou, she is my sister? And Isaac said unto him, because I said, lest I die for her. And Abimelech said, what is this thou hast done unto us? One of the people might lightly have lied with thy wife, and thou shouldest have brought guiltiness upon us. And Abimelech charged all his people, saying, he that toucheth his wife, this man or his wife, shall surely be put to death. Then Isaac sowed in that land, and received in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. Now we see from verse 1 of this chapter that this particular year in which he received the 100-fold return happened to be a year of famine, which is a blessing to see. Verse 1 says it was a famine, but he somehow got a 100-fold return. And the man waxed great and went forward and grew until he became very great. For he had possession of flocks and possession of herds and great store of servants, and the Philistines envied him. For all the wells which his father's servants had digged in the days of Abraham his father, the Philistines had stopped them and filled them with earth. And Abimelech said unto Isaac, go from us, for thou art much mightier than we. This is the same thing that's going to happen with Jacob and Laban. Jacob becomes much too mighty in all that he possesses, because what first of all takes place with Jacob, Laban apparently has no sons to begin with. Remember, he's the brother now of Rebekah. He has no sons, and he adopts Jacob as an official son. But the consuetudinary law of the Near East was that if after you had adopted someone else to be your legal son, and you ended up having children later, which is what happens with Ishmael and Isaac, remember, then the inheritance and the blessing and everything was supposed to go to your original son and not to the one that you've adopted. And this is, see, you don't get this in the text either. This is why we end up with a problem between Jacob and Laban, because we know that Laban does have some sons, but he has them after he has already adopted Jacob. Now, towards the end of this chapter, all we have here is the contention between the Philistines and the servants of Isaac over the digging of wells. They dig 2 wells. The Philistines come along and strive with them over the well. Finally, down in verse 21, they dig a 3rd well and are allowed to keep it. Another well is dug over in verse 33. And he called it Sheba. Therefore, the name of the city is Beersheba. Sheba just means an oath, and Beer the well, so it's the well of the oath. The name of the city is Beersheba unto this day. Now, you remember where Beersheba is down here, so you know what territory they're occupying now down here in the very southern part of Palestine. Well, go back over to chapter 21 again. See, here Isaac is naming this well here Beersheba. But look over in chapter 21 in verse 31. And of course, a well, he's not just naming the well. If you've got an oasis, which this is what it amounts to, if it's in a well, it's an oasis, and in a desert country, then you're going to have some type of town or city springing up around that. So not only is he naming this well Beersheba, that's going to be the name of the whole town, Beersheba. But Abraham has already named the place Beersheba. Wherefore he called that place Beersheba, because there they swear, both of them. Thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech rose up, and Phicol, the chief captain of his host, and they returned into the land of the Philistines. And Abraham planted a grove in Beersheba, and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham journeyed in the Philistines' land many days. But that's not near as much of a problem as verse 14 presents to us. I trust some of you are seeing how complicated and intricate the whole word really is here. If you don't know these things now, if you don't know these places and these names, and you do any type of in-depth study, it'll be nothing but mass confusion to you. How are we going to have a Beersheba over there? We've already got a Beersheba with Abraham naming it. But according to verse 14 of chapter 21, we already have a Beersheba before that. And Abraham rose up early in the morning, took bread and a bottle of water, gave it unto Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, and the child, and sent her away, and she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And we haven't even got to the end of the chapter where it's first named for the first time, Beersheba. Pardon? No, this doesn't have to be a redactor at this time. All this is Moses. Because you see, by the time of Moses, this is known as Beersheba there. So it would have been known by something else in verse 14, but he would just use the name that it was known by in his day, which would not be the same as a redactor if Moses, who's the anointed historian, is putting these things in. He's just using the name Beersheba. He doesn't mean that at the time of verse 14, it has the name of Beersheba. Okay? All right, then what do we do with the other two passages? The end of chapter 21 is the first naming of the place Beersheba. Now, when we get over here to the end of chapter 26, Isaac knows that place is named Beersheba, but it's just an added emphasis that he's calling it Beersheba again. It's not that he doesn't know that it's named Beersheba, and we have a mere coincidence here, which would be totally unlikely, that he's going to name the exact same place Beersheba. He knows it's named Beersheba, but it's like he's saying this is Beersheba. This really is Beersheba, because this is the well of the oak. Okay, well, we need to look at these last two verses stuck in here for us to realize the downward progression of Esau. And Esau was 40 years old when he took to wife Judith, the daughter of Beeri, the Hittite, and Bashemat, the daughter of Elon, the Hittite. So he's married two women, both of them are Hittites, both of them not of God, which were a grief of mine unto Isaac and to Rebekah. The Hittite kingdom, well, the Hittite kingdom, you remember where Cappadocia was? Our studies with Paul. It was a central eastern province there in Asia Minor, where Cappadocia. This is where the old Hittite kingdom was from. Now going into chapter 27, this is very familiar. We're not going to read this, but we have Jacob stealing the blessing. He already has the birthright, but there were two important things that the eldest son was supposed to receive. First of all, he was to receive the birthright, which amounted to a double portion blessing. This is where Elisha gets the term over in 2 Kings 2, I believe, of asking for a double portion of the Spirit upon Elijah. The birthright was a double portion blessing of the material possessions that his father had. And along with the birthright went the right of leadership. This is why it's called the birthright, because it's the right that came by way of birth. That is, by way of you being the firstborn. Which has a lot to do, if you remember some of the teaching, well, that was last year, probably over a year ago, in the several tapes on Jesus dying spiritually. You have to understand what it means to be the firstborn, what it means to possess the birthright, because Jesus, we know, is called over in Romans 8, Colossians 1, the firstborn among many brethren. It means he possessed the inheritance rights, the birthrights from his heavenly Father. Doesn't mean he's the first to be born, because remember, Jacob now has the birthright. That doesn't mean he's the firstborn. He's the secondborn here. So we know that being the firstborn has nothing to do with when you're born. It was supposed to. But what that came to mean is that you received the birthright. And this was a double portion blessing of the possessions, and you were to be the leader of all your brethren. The second thing, which is what chapter 27 is all about, is the blessing. And this wasn't just some small thing, but this was generally an oral prophetic blessing that the father gave to the eldest son, which was given as a means of confirmation of the birthright. So the birthright, he's already gotten that earlier. Chapter 27 ought to be familiar to you from Sunday school. He comes in hairy, and remember Isaac, old now, and blesses Jacob, not knowing what he's doing, which we'll look at over, and we'll just look at the blessing that he does give him. Verse 27, he came near and kissed him, and he smelled the smell of his raiment and blessed him and said, See, the smell of my son is as the smell of a field which the Lord hath blessed. Therefore God give thee of the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth and plenty of corn and wine. Let people serve thee, and nations bow down to thee. Be Lord over thy brethren, and let thy mother's sons bow down to thee. Cursed be every one that curseth thee, and blessed be he that blesseth thee. Same thing that God gave to Abram in chapter 12 and verses 2 and 3. So here's the oral prophetic blessing that we see from verse 33 is quite binding. Now that Esau has come in from hunting, Isaac trembled very exceedingly and said, Where is he that hath taken venison and brought it me? And I have eaten of all before thou camest, and have blessed him, yea, and he shall be blessed. An irrevocable blessing that he placed upon Jacob because he was subtle enough to deceive him into receiving the blessing. Now you say, well, isn't that pretty bad for him to do that? Certainly it is. But God is still working. Doesn't mean that God condones that, but God is working by providence to make sure that Jacob, which is the one that God has already foreordained to be the one to receive not only the birthright, but the blessing. He does go on to give a minor blessing to Esau, but it's still a blessing of subjection to his brother.
For the continuation of